Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out to the talk tonight. We wanted to just make sure that everyone knows that next week is our last lecture in the series, the Hartford History Lecture Series. And I'll get some booze over there. That's great. I'm glad to hear that. So it's been great doing this season. We've had some wonderful lectures, and we had a great tour. And I hope that those who've joined us online have enjoyed it as well. And so I want to thank the Old State House, and I want to thank CTN for hosting us and for filming. And I wanted to also let you know that our last talk of the season is going to be about the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and so appropriately we are holding it at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. So next week's talk will not be here, and Bill Hosley will be giving that lecture. Bill Hosley co-founded this series with me 6 years ago, and it's still going strong. We're excited about that. But Bill is going to be stepping down from the organizing committee. He might give a talk or two, in the future, but he'll be stepping down from that. So I hope people will come out and be there for that moment as we recognize and celebrate Bill. And I'm going to invite Bill to come up now and introduce our program for tonight and our speakers.
43 years ago, I accepted a part-time job at the Wadsworth Athenaeum for the summer. And things went well, and my boss in August said, would you like to stick around through the fall? Well, this has been a while. But during that summer, I said, well, the one thing, if I'm only in Connecticut for 3 months, I really want to know what's at Connecticut Historical Society, because at that point, my passion in life was for rural furniture and decorative arts and Connecticut stuff. And so I've spent hundreds, literally, of days in the research collections and archives at CHS, and it is truly a national treasure, one of the oldest historical organizations in the country. This evening we have the two Andreas. Andrea Slater is the Crofut Archivist, and Marcy Crofut is a name, maybe you can Google her, but she was one of those visionary people who did so much for Connecticut history. And she is the archivist, a graduate from the Simmons College, a wonderful library program at Simmons University in Boston. Andrea Rapacz is the chief curator of collections at CHS and has knows where all the bodies are buried there, and I am sure will dazzle us or thrill us with whatever they have to show and tell. Thank you all for tuning in, and welcome to Andrea and Andrea.
Oops, which side do you want to be on? Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you, Bill. So we're so glad to be here to share the history of the Connecticut Museum with you. And so I think, as you know, we changed our name just 4 months ago. So we kind of go back and forth between saying CHS, Connecticut Museum. So I've worked at CHS for a long time, and I felt like I had a really good handle on the history, but until I started researching this, I found out a lot of new things. So this was kind of a fun project to work on and do some more things about that. So a little background about the organization today. We're a library, a museum, and education center that focuses on the history of Connecticut. We offer programs for all ages, and our research center is open to anyone who wants to research Connecticut history. Hopefully some of you have been there doing your research on either your family or your own projects. We have a staff of 50 people, full-time and part-time, that make all of that happen. Should I just click on that? Click it off? Okay. So our collection today, we've been collecting for almost 200 years, and our collection is vast. So we estimate that we have 4 million individual items, and so that includes the 3.5 million manuscripts, 250,000 graphics, 130,000 books and serials, 42,000 objects, 3,700 broadsides, and 1,300 maps. And so with the millions of stories represented in our collection, we can only tell you about a few of them tonight. So I'm sure if any of my other colleagues were giving this same talk, they'd pick different objects to highlight. So this is how we got here.
Before I begin, I'd like to just say that my knowledge of the Connecticut Historical Society and now the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History has been growing every single day. I work with the institutional archives, and I honestly learn something new every day. It's a 200-year history, so I don't know if anyone could ever really be an expert. So on that note, let's start with where it all began. On May 4th, 1825, the Connecticut General Assembly passed into law a resolution establishing the Connecticut Historical Society with the mission being, or the purpose being, of discovering, procuring, and preserving whatever may relate to civil, ecclesiastical, and natural history of the United States, and especially the state of Connecticut. A bit broad, I may say. At the first meeting later that month, on May 30th, 1825, the following individuals were elected officers of the newly formed organization: John Trumbull as president, Thomas Day as recording secretary, Thomas C. Brownell as vice president, Thomas Robbins as corresponding secretary, and Walter Mitchell as treasurer. At the meeting the next day, on May 31st, the Constitution was approved. The Connecticut Historical Society met 2 more times that year in June and August, and then official activity of the organization ceased until 1839. Yeah, that's 14 years. So, after approximately 14 years of no activity, on May 1st, 1839, the Connecticut General Assembly passed an act reincorporating the Connecticut Historical Society. Later that month, at the organization's first meeting after being reincorporated, Thomas Day was chosen president and Charles Hosmer was chosen recording secretary. Other members of the organization included Henry Barnard, Thomas Gallaudet, John S. Peters, and Thomas Robbins. Thanks to research done by Aaliyah Henley, a former NERFC fellow at the CHS, we have a better understanding of the people involved with the CHS in its early years. So you may be noticing that many of these people who founded the CHS were of a certain demographic. First of all, men, but also professional men of wealth, education, and standing who descended from Anglo-American settlers. Many of the society's first officers and members were doctors, academics, ministers, lawyers, politicians, and judges. And many of them were also involved with other prominent Hartford institutions such as Trinity College and the American School for the Deaf. As mentioned, Henry Barnard was one of CHS's first members after its reorganization in 1839, and his beliefs as an education reformer likely influenced the society at this early time. Aaliyah Henley found that he imagined the society as an expansive and populace-focused. He wanted members from across the state and to publish popular historical genealogical publications, and also to hold lectures. Meanwhile, Charles Hosmer, CHS's recording secretary, would have a significant influence on our collection by accepting artifacts as part of the collection. While many other early historical societies at this time were focused more on library acquisitions, such as books and manuscripts, Charles Hosmer saw it as very important to collect material items too. So some of our earliest collections included fragments of the Charter Oak, pewter plates, iron tongues, military cannons, and swords. As a result of both Barnard's ideologies and Hosmer's acceptance of objects as donations, CHS developed a collection with popular appeal at this time of early development. And here is an image of the sword that was our first accessioned item in our collection. So it's dated 1637, and it was used by Sergeant William Hayden in the Pequot War. Obviously, our interpretation of this sword has changed throughout the many decades since it was originally donated by Thomas Robbins in 1839. So after its second founding, CHS had been holding meetings at officers' homes and at the Gilman Building on Main Street, but in 1844 moved into the newly built Wadsworth Athenaeum. That same year, Thomas Robbins became the first librarian of the Connecticut Historical Society. Prior to his appointment as librarian, he had spent 46 years as a minister of several different congregations across Connecticut and Massachusetts. During this time, he amassed a library of over 4,000 books. When he moved to Hartford to accept the position of librarian, with him came his books, and soon after, they were part of the permanent collection at CHS. With Robbins as librarian, the CHS rooms at the Athenaeum were open 6 days a week, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., and then 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Later that year that we were in the Athenaeum, we also acquired these 4 engravings by Amos Doolittle of Lexington and Concord from 1775. Again, due to the research of Aaliyah Henley, we now have a better understanding of the visitors and donors of CHS in the early days of the Athenaeum. Notably, in 1850 alone, more than 3,700 people stopped into the CHS rooms long enough to sign into the visitor log. Considering that the population of Hartford was about 13,000 at this time, that's a pretty significant number. CHS's visitor log from 1850 includes the name of notable individuals such as Sarah M. Grimke, abolitionist and women's rights advocate, Elmira Lincoln Phelps, scientist and educator, Clement C. Moore of A Visit from St. Nicholas fame, and 12-year-old J. Pierpont Morgan. Of course, visitors largely came from the ranks as the society's members, but did include a range of occupations and professions. So we had higher level professions and occupations such as those who worked in law, medicine, ministry, merchants and bankers visiting, but also farmers and laborers, including peddlers and factory operators, and women. So although there were no female founders of either CHS's first or second founding, and it should be noted that there was a lack of other voices as well, including those of Black individuals, women did interact with the society as both visitors and donors of collections from the very beginning of its reincorporation in 1839. In the 1840s, there were close to 100 known women donors of collection items, including Miss Hannah Whittlesey's donation in 1840 of a pair of ladies' shoes worked by Hannah Edwards, as well as Colonel William Ledyard's waistcoat donated by Maria Ledyard in 1841, both shown here. On March 6, 1849, the Society voted that the members of the Society have the liberty to introduce ladies at the reading of papers before the Society. At the next meeting on March 20th, it was noted that a number of ladies and gentlemen were present this evening. In 1850, women accounted for more than a third of known visitors, many being the daughters and wives of middle and upper class white men. The first known female member of CHS was historian Ellen Douglas Larned in 1870. Beginning in the 1890s with the membership of Lucy Abigail Barnard, women began to take a more active role as members in the society. Around the same time that CHS was establishing itself at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, Augustus Washington, a Black daguerreotypist photographer, opened his studio also on Main Street in Hartford, operating from about 1846 to 1852. Washington took portraits of wealthy and prominent Hartford individuals, including Eliphalet Adams Buckley, the founder and president of Aetna Insurance Company, who was also active in state politics. CHS acquired this daguerreotype of Buckley along with others of his family in the 1960s. A number of Washington daguerreotypes in our collection were featured in the 1999 exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C.
So in the second half of the 1800s, I think you guys have gotten some background about the 4 organizations that were housed at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Everyone was needing more space and kind of moving around. In the mid-1800s, David Watkinson also planned for the CHS and the library to be linked. So when he died, he left money for stacks to be built that were adjacent to the CHS's rooms. Then a few years later, CHS needed to move into those stacks, and then the Watkinson Library built another annex. It started to get very confusing, and I was like, I need to go to the Wadsworth and walk around and figure out where all of this stuff was. It was during the completion of that last expansion, around 1892, when CHS hired their youngest member, Albert Carlos Bates, who's on the left, who was about 24 at the time. And they brought him in to help reshelve material. By 1893, Bates was hired as the librarian and would continue to build CHS's collection for the next 50 years. There was a focus on 18th century books printed in Connecticut, newspapers, pamphlets, as well as the family letters, diaries, almanacs, wills, and deeds. Until the 1940s, CHS was not focusing specifically on Connecticut and was also collecting natural history specimens. Also, as Andrea had mentioned, around this time in 1890, more women were starting to apply for membership, and the woman on the right is Lucy A. Brainerd. So she heeded the call from the librarians who asked members to donate and give funds, and she anonymously started the first fund for acquiring books. We have very few images of what CHS looked like in the Athenaeum, but these two photos show the book stacks and the exhibition hall around 1895. In addition to these spaces, CHS had secure vaults in the basement of the Athenaeum for the storage of the manuscripts and the newspapers. In the photo in the left, on the way back, you can see hanging on the wall is CHS's first librarian, Thomas Robbins. And on the right, you can see there are some chairs in the middle. The 17th century turned chair. That was in the background of the picture of the Thomas Robbins picture that Andrea showed you, and they also found in Thomas Robbins's diary there was a note that his grandfather likely died in that chair, so it's got a little bit of history. And it's still on display at the Connecticut Historical Society now in our exhibition, Making Connecticut. It's hard to see from here, but on the table there's a box, and in that is a fragment of the charter. And that charter is actually on display downstairs in this building in the History is All Around Us exhibit. So I just want to say a moment about conservation. It looks like there are big windows in there and light is streaming in. Now we have the charter is in a very dark case with very high-tech fiber optic lighting on it. So throughout CHS's history, they've talked about not just having the stuff, but making sure people were able to use it. And starting in 1860, CHS started publishing these, what they called their collections. The first one was published in 1860, and I was looking back, and that probably means someone was transcribing the documents and sending them to a printer to get set. By the time 1893 rolled around, CHS started getting a yearly appropriation from Connecticut's legislature to edit and publish these records and documents. As part of this agreement, CHS needed to give 300 copies to the state library and to distribute as they saw fit. CHS stopped publishing these collections around the 1970s. You can really see how some of these were really worn. The ones in the middle have brand new bindings, and then the ones on the ends were not used as much. So you can just see how frequently people were accessing them. In preparation for this presentation, I read through all the annual reports from 1890 to 1983. And so through most of the reports, the librarians were calling for more resources to collect items and for staff to process them, because there was a pretty big backlog that was building up. After Thomas Robbins passed away, there wasn't another librarian for a number of years. So also in 1892, when Albert Carlos Bates was helping to sort things out, he finds a little something just sitting on a shelf, and it just happens to be Nathan Hale's diary. I think all of you know Nathan Hale is Connecticut's state hero. So the diary was left there with research notes from Isaac W. Stewart, who wrote a biography about Hale in 1861. So it's just sort of, no one was there to take care of it, but fortunately no one disturbed it, and there it was. So other objects we have in our collection that are related to Nathan Hale, we have his camp basket that is actually still has straw in it and some broken glass that someone has thought was a broken French wine bottle. That was donated to CHS in 1844. And then we also have this beautiful engraving that's called The Last Words of Captain Nathan Hale. So even though there was more space than ever before, in 1895, it quickly becomes apparent to Bates that more space is needed. And so in the 1890s, there was the creation of a lot of the lineage societies, the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the next year, the Colonial Dames, the Order of the Founders and Patriots of America. And so he notices people are coming in because they want to be able to get into these groups, and that the research center is incredibly busy. And so if you see this table here, there are spots for 6 people. And he's like, sometimes we have people up to 10. So he's calling from space from the beginning. He's also very, it's interesting in his library reports in the annual report about how he's talking about how people are handling the material and, people are licking their fingers, stacking them, pushing them down. So we didn't have quite the same kind of that we have in our research center today. In the early 1900s, the Wadsworth Athenaeum received generous bequests from Elizabeth Colt and J.P. Morgan to build additions and expand their structure. This meant that CHS would have to suspend work during construction, and they were not sure what it was going to mean long-term for their space. The Colt Memorial opened to the public in 1910 and the Morgan Memorial in 1915. CHS was given more vault space, but also according to Bates, he said although they were moved into a larger room, he didn't have as much linear feet as he had before, so storage was still at a premium. It was also interesting to see what happened during World War I for the operations of the society. They talked about how there were fewer members and people coming in. There was a coal shortage, so they started having heatless Mondays. I'm not sure if that was a citywide thing. And they would only light the chandelier when they had meetings. And there was a real fear of fire all the time here with all of this paper. Just to go back for a second. I think those things at the end of the tables, I don't know if those are gas burners or, but something I hadn't thought about, because when I think about dangers at the facility now, I'm worried more about water, not about fire. So it was just kind of interesting to see about that.
So some of the most frequently used items in our collection are those relating to Samuel Colt. In 1854, Samuel Colt was listed as a member of the CHS, and the next year, in 1855, he presented to the society a presentation pistol, which is shown here. In November of 1918, Charles Edward Goss, president of CHS at the time, donated a significant collection of Colt's papers. This collection consisted of approximately 3,500 documents from the 19th century. Since this donation, at least 7 later collections of Colt papers have been added to this one, so a bit of an artificial collection, and that's a story for another time. But our vast collection of Samuel Colt papers is one of the most requested manuscript collection, and it was recently used by Jim Rassenberger for his publication, Revolver, Sam Colt and the Six-Shooter That Changed America. Did you have anything to say about the crib?
So I feel like with Bill here, you probably could talk about it better. So by the Colt Armory, they also grew these willows to make these willowware baskets, and so the workers at that company made that crib for the Colt family. And if you get up really close, you can see on each end, or on each finial, there's a Colt's head, because Colt was the master of branding and had to have the Colt on everything. Also just wanted to mention that the gun that is pictured here is also on display downstairs, and history is all around us. Let's see. In 1922, CHS received its largest monetary gift anonymously. It was $20,000 worth of railroad bonds to construct a fireproof building. It wasn't a few years later, when benefactor George E. Hoadley died, that CHS discovered that he also left half of his estate. That was worth about $250,000 at the time. Hoadley was not as involved in the society as his brother Charles Hoadley had been. He had been president of the society at one point and the state librarian. It wasn't until after his death that George became a member, and for the next 10 years, the society talks about the prospects of building a new building. And all this time, Hoadley's donation is growing in the bank, and they're undecided because they have no land. They feel like moving out would go against Daniel Wadsworth and David Watkinson's wishes, and the members didn't want to move. So in 1929, they're getting so crowded, for the first time, they packed up 500 boxes of collections and moved them to an off-site location. Finally, in 1930, CHS buys a parcel of land on the corner of Washington and Buckingham Streets. They felt that this lot was perfect because it was close to the Athenaeum and also close to the state library. They had money to build a building but not maintain it, so they hold off, and it's 30 more years before CHS has a new home. So back to some of the items in the collection. So this is a selection from some of the items. The painting to the left was donated in 1870 from Mrs. Charles Floyer Pond and Elizabeth Pond of Elizabeth Park. The description says that this is the Park River with the buildings along the left that are Main Street. And so this is what CHS would have looked like when Hartford looked like when CHS was founded. The coat is a rare surviving example of a military officer's uniform coat from a Loyalist Tory regiment. It was worn by Munson Haight, a native of Norwalk, Connecticut, and from 1777 to 1783, he served as a lieutenant in the Prince of Wales's British American Regiment, which was organized in Middletown. The needlework in the upper right-hand corner was worked by Faith Trumbull. She was a daughter of the Revolutionary War Governor Jonathan Trumbull. Her brother John was also a famous artist who credited her with his artistic ability and inspiration. The piece came in with a different attribution, but a former staff member was able to pinpoint the maker because in Jonathan Trumbull's letters, he asks his son John to buy a frame for his sister's needlework with dimensions. Faith was married to Jedediah Huntington, who was another prominent family at the time of the Revolution. And of course, in the lower right-hand corner is Mark Twain's bicycle. Whoops, went too far. So we also have a number of items related to Abraham Lincoln in our collection. On the upper left-hand side is a linen banner for the Wide Awakes. The Wide Awakes were young Republicans who were early and active supporters of Abraham Lincoln. They had a strong anti-slavery platform, and today their abolitionist tendencies might be interpreted as an enlightened view of civil rights, but they were also very anti-Catholic and anti-immigration. They organized impressive torchlight parades, all dressed in black oilcloth capes and caps and holding lanterns. The Wide Awake movement began in Hartford and therefore in the past was a source of pride for many Connecticut people. The flag in the middle is our Lincoln flag. It was one of the two flags draping the front of Lincoln's box the night he was assassinated. It was years immediately following Lincoln's assassination, the CHS's Treasury Guard flag lay forgotten in a basement at the Treasury building. Then in 1872, the head of the Treasury Department security, Henry A. Cobaugh, discovered it there and hung it in his office. By the 1880s, so many people wanted to see the flag that Cobaugh had a special case made for it and placed it on display elsewhere in the Treasury. By 1900, there were questions about where it should go to get properly preserved and displayed, and its owners, the veterans of the Treasury Guard, were undecided. So in 1907, Cobaugh gave the boxed flag to Edgar S. Yergeson of Hartford, a well-respected Civil War veteran and Civil War collector, and a White House confidant and interior designer. He was also a Wide Awake. The implement in the upper right-hand corner is a maul, and so when Abraham Lincoln was elected, Jonathan F. Morris, an avid Lincoln supporter from Hartford, wanted to obtain a souvenir of Lincoln for the members of the political club he belonged to, the Wide Awakes. And Lincoln had been promoted as a simple rail splitter during the election campaign, so what better souvenir than a maul? So Morris wrote to his friend in Springfield, who was a neighbor of Lincoln's, and asked him if he could get a maul used by Lincoln. A cousin of Lincoln's eventually obtained the maul, shipped it to Connecticut, and presented it to the Wide Awake Club in 1890. To the Wide Awake Club. And then in 1895, after they disbanded, it was donated to the Connecticut Historical Society. The object on the lower right hand is a lock of Lincoln's hair that was taken right after he was assassinated. That was given to us by Elizabeth Dixon Welling, who John Dixon was the senator of Connecticut at that time, and his wife was very close with Mary Todd Lincoln. So the letter in that frame is from Mary Todd Lincoln's brother to Mrs. Dixon. So it feels like it has a pretty strong provenance. In 1875, Caroline Hewins came to Hartford from Boston to become the librarian of the Young Men's Institute and continued on in that post to become the first librarian when that organization transitioned into the Hartford Public Library in 1892. Being a children's book collector herself, she built a worthy collection at the Hartford Public Library for both adults and children. During her tenure, it became clear that the library needed a children's room, and it wasn't until 1904 when the Current ran an article with a photograph taken on a Sunday showing children outnumbering the adults 51-2 that they relented and let her create a room specifically for children. CHS librarian Albert Carlos Bates was also a children's book collector, so one can imagine the two had much to talk about. So in 1823, Hewins donated her impressive children's book collection to CHS. About 20 years later, Bates donated his children's book collection to CHS, and it's believed to be one of the top 4 18th and 19th century children's book collections in the country. So the photo on the right of is Caroline Hewins, and there's a handwritten scrawl at the top that said Miss Hewins in the early library days. So I was able to zoom in on the Etna calendar that's there, and this was taken in 1890. So just to give you a flavor of what it looked like. And then on the shelf in our stacks of the Hewins collection. Sorry. And so the Mary Morris social scrapbooks, we just only included these because this is an interesting example of how technology has changed how we use our collection. So each one of these books that's on the left, Mary Morris painstakingly cut out of a newspaper and taped and glued in, and then she kept an index at the front. It was an incredibly amount of work. And for many years, it was a resource for people. I mean, Bill and I were talking about this before, like when you couldn't just type it into historical newspapers and find an article. To try to track this stuff down in newspapers took forever. So this was used for years, and even in the 1990s, early 2000s, CHS had these all digitized. So they are available and are searchable, but now that you can get the Springfield Gazette, you can get the Hartford Courant, it's not used as much anymore. So it's one of those collections that we need to look at.
In 1934, CHS purchased the papers of the Primus family, a prominent black family living in Hartford in the mid-1800s. It is a heavily used collection because it's a rare example of correspondence between two young black women, Addie Brown and Rebecca Primus, from the late 1850s and 60s. The collection also includes letters of Rebecca's brother, Nelson Primus, who was a painter. This collection of papers was recently digitized and made available on the CTDA with support from Capital Community College in 2021. In the 1960s, CHS Bulletin editor Phyllis Kinn was looking through our manuscript collection to find material for an article she was working on, and she came upon the uncatalogued box of Primus papers. Upon doing research on the Primus family, she learned that Nelson Primus had painted a portrait of actress Lizzie Mae Ulmer. This rang a bell with CHS's curator at the time, Philip Dunbar, who soon purchased that exact portrait of Ulmer by Nelson Primus for the collection. Talk about fate.
So in the 1930s, CHS started to modernize a bit. Because of the Depression, new president Edgar Waterman started to look at how funds were invested and made some changes as a result of what happened during the stock market crash, and to help the investments weather against what he called crippling loss. Also, CHS starts to produce its bulletin that's a member benefit and outreach tool. It is made up of articles about collections and then other historical topics. The bulletin was published into the 80s and early 1990s. Also in the 1930s, the reading room is being heavily used by WPA historical records researchers. Bates also hires Thompson Harlow as assistant librarian in 1938, and Miss Hoxie was hired soon thereafter. After U.S. declares war in 1941, CHS staff moves all paintings not in vaults to other locations. This gave them the opportunity to paint the hall and to rearrange the exhibition at the war's end. Tom Harlow was given a leave of absence to fight overseas and was wounded. He returns home and spends the next 17 months in the hospital recovering while Miss Hoxie is holding down the fort. So this is Miss Hoxie in her reading room at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. And I love that one of those oak tables in the back is still in Andrea's office today. George Dudley Seymour was a longtime supporter and member of CHS for 32 years. He was a lawyer involved in city planning in New Haven and an avid collector of decorative arts and portraiture. Upon his death, he left at least 1,500 objects donated: portraits, furniture, textiles, glassware, ceramics, baskets, stove, and a staff favorite is the leach jar that's in the middle. This collection was stored in an off-site location until CHS was to build a new building. He also left funds to care for his collection and a separate fund to construct a new building. By now, it was clear that CHS needed to be more focused in its collecting, and in the 1947 bylaw revision, they said that they were only going to take in material that was related to Connecticut. Also at this time, Bates retires and becomes the artist, and Tom Harlow is promoted to librarian. 1950 is a big year for the Connecticut Historical Society. Librarian Tom Harlow was named the first director of CHS. The fire marshal makes a visit to the Wadsworth Athenaeum and makes the CHS move 2,000 cubic feet of material to an off-site location, and then makes this major move. So it's been 30 years since Hoadley made his first donation. And so the story of how that happened was actually quite interesting and also came out of the reading the annual reports. So Waterman had been very conservative, saying, we can build a building, but we can't maintain it. And so one day, Jack Davis, who was the president of Connecticut Printers and also on the CHS board, was having lunch at the Hartford Club, and he overheard that the Veeder Mansion was on sale, and they were offering it to the Hartford Seminary, Hartford Public Library for a branch, and a fire insurance company. And so he's walking back to his office and he's thinking about it, and he takes a detour into the Athenaeum to see Tom Harlow. And he's like, you have to get the standing committee together in the next 2 days. We have to talk about this. And Tom Harlow's like, we only meet 2 times a year and it takes us weeks to get this group together. But somehow he got them all together, and within 2 weeks, CHS purchased the property at 1 Elizabeth Street. So things can move quick. After the move to Elizabeth Street, the membership doubles, and there's talk about how to keep younger audiences engaged. And I feel like that is something that is as old as time. According to Tom Harlow, these younger members are interested in renovating old houses and antique furniture, and starts to offer programming that would satisfy that. The next year, they hire an assistant director, William Warren, who's a curator, and the collection starts to go in that direction. Warren had a background in decorative arts, textiles, and paintings. Not soon after CHS moves and starts constructing an addition, it suffers from a flooding of biblical proportions. The 1955 flood caused major damage to the collections due to the proactive and quick thinking of staff member Marjorie Waterman, no manuscripts or rare books were damaged. Approximately 29,000 volumes were affected, but many of the books were out of scope and they were planned to be deaccessioned. So there's a look at our basement stacks. So this needlework on the left is probably the Connecticut Museum's most published image. It's a needlework done by Prudence Punderson between 1776 and 1783. Here she shows herself in 3 different views at birth, mid-age, and death. It also has a very rare and very early image of an enslaved woman. Her family were loyalists, and they fled to Long Island during the Revolutionary War. Prudence died a year after completing this work from complications due to childbirth. In addition to the needlework, the table and the inkwell, as well as the mirror that's depicted, are all in the Connecticut Museum's collection. We also have an amazing collection of letters between the family members that are sometimes challenging to untangle because there are a number of Prudences and Ebenezers in the family. So here's a few more items just in the CHS collection. Aetna Insurance Company President Morgan B. Brainerd was an avid collector of early American art and artifacts. He also had a huge fondness for tavern signs, and he called that one of his eccentric tastes, which he attributed to his boyhood memories of seeing several that still swung from their old posts of the old inns. Realizing that if no one preserved these useless objects, they would soon be chopped up for firewood, Brainerd rescued dozens of forgotten signs from barns and attics. Following his wishes, the collection was donated to CHS by his widow and his heirs after his death in 1957. Today, Brainerd's collection forms the core of the nation's largest 18th and 19th century tavern signs. On the left, you see a slant front desk. Frederick and Margaret Barber were Connecticut furniture collectors who, after 30 years of collecting, found that the market was drying up and they had a very difficult time trying to find examples of elegant Connecticut furniture, as they called it. So they decided that they thought the collection should be kept together and preserved, and over a number of years donated over 50 pieces of furniture to the Connecticut Historical Society. Some of these items I just thought were kind of interesting. We have a very rare 18th century man's wig that's made out of human hair. There are miniature rubber boots that are about this big that were used at the 1893 World's Fair as kind of an example of a Connecticut industry. And then the picture on the bottom right is one of a series that we have of the construction of the Bulkley Bridge here in Hartford.
Florence S. Marcy Crofut was born in 1875 in Brooklyn, New York. In 1901, she moved with her family to Hartford. From 1928 through 1937, she researched and wrote a 2-volume guide to the history and historic sites of Connecticut. She was an active member of many organizations, including the National Society of the Colonial Dames of Connecticut and the Daughters of the American Revolution. She served as chairman of the chapter committee on preservation and restoration of the Old State House, which included its renovation and visitor program in the late 1950s. She became a member of the Connecticut Historical Society in 1921. In 1940, she was appointed recording secretary of the CHS, a position she served until her death in 1974 at the age of 98. After her death, she bequeathed a large portion of her estate to CHS, which included approximately 2,500 museum objects and a large manuscript collection, some of which are shown here. She also established an endowed fund for the acquisition of rare books and manuscripts at the CHS, and I personally have Florence Crofut to thank because my position as archivist is endowed by this fund.
So these are more selection of items that were collected between the 1980s and the 2000s. In the upper left-hand corner is a sampler stitched in 1839 by a young girl named Miranda Robinson. This is typical of samplers being made at the time, but what makes this sampler particularly special and rare is that Miranda is an 8-year-old young black girl when she makes this. And there's only one other known example of a Connecticut girl, a young black Connecticut girl making a sampler at this time. In 1982, after 128 years, the Honus restaurant on State Street closed. The inside walls of the restaurant were covered with over 600 photographs, prints, and paintings. When a CHS staff member heard the restaurant was closing, they made a plea to have the collection donated to CHS. The topics of the collection include local celebrities, sports teams, horse races, and Connecticut locations. There are 2 examples here. So the one at the bottom left is 937 Main Street, which is just up the street and across from Capital Community College. The other one is Bill Savitt and Babe Ruth. Bill Savitt was a very well-known Hartford jeweler and a huge Hartford supporter. And Babe Ruth's last exhibition game was played here in Hartford in a Savitt Gems uniform. Also acquired in 1997 is this incredibly rare anti-slavery banner found in an attic in Plainfield. We're in a room now where the Amistad Africans had their court case. When we did an exhibition on the Amistad in 1998, this piece featured prominently in it. CHS also purchased the diary and collection of over 230 photographs of Hollywood actress Freddie Washington. That's in the bottom middle. She's pictured here with some unidentified friends. Washington started her career in the 1920s dancing at the Cotton Club in Harlem before working in motion pictures. She helped found the Negro Actors Guild of America in 1937 and was active in the NAACP. In 1979, she was inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame, and she moved into Connecticut in the 1950s and lived in the Greenwich and Stamford area. 2 major projects that also happened in the early 2000s was a West Indian oral history project and a Puerto Rican community Nuestras Historias project. The West Indian Social Club was approaching its 50th anniversary, and the president, Keith Carr, approached our director, David Kahn, with an idea for a collaborative oral history project and exhibition. Fiona Vernal, who I think spoke to you and is also Connecticut Museum's first president, was still a student at Yale when she was hired to conduct those oral histories. Additional videos were filmed of some of the younger community members, and many of this raw material and community involvement, was turned into a 2,000 square foot exhibition funded by Connecticut Humanities. A few years later, CHS worked with the Puerto Rican community in Hartford and collected stories and created a bilingual website with audio clips. That was pretty high-tech stuff for the 2000s. I just think of how expensive and specialized it was to try to create a website then. And just within the last few years, we were able to archive all of these oral histories and have them digitized and make them accessible on the Connecticut Digital Archive.
So a large and significant collection that has come into our collection lately, within the past few years, is the collection of the Smith Worthington Saddlery Company. The company was founded in 1794 by Norman Smith and operated continuously in Hartford until it closed 2 years ago after 227 years of business. The company was the oldest saddle-making company in America and produced saddles, harnesses, and other equipment for horseback riding, such as bridles and stirrups. In the 20th century, the company evolved to produce other leather goods, including leather holsters, dog collars and muzzles, cartridge belts, and more. The collection consists of approximately 20 linear feet of manuscript material, hundreds of photographs, as well as objects, including this store sign shown here. Another very large collection that's come to the Connecticut Museum recently is the collection of the Connecticut Cultural Heritage Arts Program. In 2013, Jody Blankenship was hired as CEO, and he really worked to bring CHAP to CHS. CHAP began in 1991 and is a program that promotes Connecticut cultural traditional artists and their communities through documentation, technical assistance, and public presentation. The archives consists of tens of thousands of images and audio and video recordings that document approximately 50 of Connecticut's cultural, ethnic, and occupational groups and approximately 350 different artists. In 2020, the CHS received a large grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences to catalog the collection and make it available on the CTDA. With such a large collection, there's still work to be done to make the collection accessible, so funding from Connecticut Humanities will allow contract staff to continue to work on the project for another year.
Another recent and large collecting initiative that grew out of the COVID pandemic was the Community History Project. Like many organizations around the country, CHS set up an online collecting portal to collect people's stories and images. What we didn't get were stories for people on the front lines and people working across the state. So with funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we hired a project director and partnered with the organizations listed on the slide: Hartford Public Library, New Haven Public Library, the Otis Library in Norwich, and Christ Cathedral Church to identify people in their communities who could be interviewed. Just under 100 interviews were collected and will also be available on the Connecticut Digital Archive. We received additional funding from the federal government this year to expand this project to a 2-year project to collect more stories across the state, not necessarily COVID-related, and we'll be partnering with colleges in all corners of the state. So we talk about how technology affects our collection, and so another big project that the collections department is going to be taking on for the next 3 years is digitizing our Revolutionary War materials. We received an earmark from the federal government to do that. It's going to take about 3 years. We're going to hire 4 additional staff to work on it. And we're really going to be able to take the time to really look through almost every page that's in it. And we are really hoping to uncover stories that we didn't know about before. I think we estimated 66,000 pages that we were going to digitize as part of this project. And so with the America 250 coming up soon, we're hoping this will be a great resource. And thank you all. And we hope you come visit the museum and research in our library.
Well, thank you very much. That was fantastic, and I'm sure there are going to be some questions. So I'll bring the mic around if anybody wants to ask something.
Thank you. That was great. On the subject of digitizing, the Hartford Current is digitized from the beginning of time, 1764, to the present. It strikes me that a real gap in our understanding of history and local history is the Hartford Times, for many, many decades, was the more prominent paper of the two, and yet we don't have the stories from their perspective of the area. Is there any work being done to try and digitize the Hartford Times, and are you guys involved?
Not that I know of. I know the Connecticut State Library has a newspapers digitization project. We do have a run of Hartford Times, but that's not something that we're looking at right now. If we had all the resources in the world, we definitely would do it.
I didn't quite get what you said about Augustus Washington. And also, do you know anything about the owner of the mansion that you're presently in?
Yeah, we'll jump back to those slides.
Where is he?
He's at the beginning. So Augustus Washington was a black daguerreotype photographer in Hartford, and we have quite a number. I'm not exactly sure how many, about 13 daguerreotypes photographed by him in our collection, including the ones that are shown here. There was an exhibit at the National Portrait Gallery in 1999, a durable memento, and we were part of that exhibit.
Available online as well. And just to let you know, too, Augustus Washington is featured in our exhibit at Capital Community College. which is showing the history of the Talcott Street Congregational Church, the first black church in Hartford. And he was the headmaster of their school for a couple of years. The owner of the mansion.
Sure. Curtis Veeder was an industrialist. He was born in Pennsylvania, and I forget why he moved up to Hartford, who he was going to work for, but he made those counters or odometers that you used to see in old gas pumps. And so he had a number of patents on different things. Correct. He's the Veeder of Veeder-Root. Did you want more about Veeder, or is that? Okay.
Little Augustus Washington story. The greatest fish that got away in my life was a photograph he took of John Brown in 1848 in Hartford, and it's the best portrait that was ever done of John Brown, and it should be here, but it's in the National Gallery. I was interested in the Smith Worthington. Is that a pretty extensive archive, and do they have sales records and just the whole evolution of the?
Here, I can go to those slides. I didn't include any photos of the manuscripts, but there's about like 20 cartons of material that I actually went through. A lot of account books and ledgers dating all the way back to 1794 when the business was founded. It's a really amazing archive. It's so extensive. You can get an amazing picture of the company over the years and how they had to adapt as horses obviously became less of the main mode of transportation in the 20th century. Yeah, it's a great collection.
I have a question about Nelson Primus. So you have one of his portraits or one of his paintings? Do you know where others are, or no idea?
I don't know.
And I have an obscure question. Was it common for people to send hair from a dead person as mementos?
I think so.
It was.
We have a lot of hair in our collection from various individuals over time.
A few years back, in our ancestral home in my family, I found five little envelopes with hair cuttings from my great-grandmother and her siblings.
Yeah.
I was like, okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm involved with the process to establish the Coltsville National Historical Park, and I know you have some goods over there. I'm wondering whether you all are thinking much about how to take advantage of the establishment of the park when it comes along.
I think a little bit. We've been in contact and talking to Kelly Fellner, who is over there. So because it feels like it's kind of far away, we haven't made any concrete plans yet, but I think there's a desire to have some collaboration there.
Thanks so much. Hi, Andrea. Good to see you again. Could you tell us a little bit about sort of the conversation that led to you changing your name and the logo also? I'd be curious to hear sort of, I know a lot of historical societies have been rebranding and what, it's not one size fits all, and the conversation is different in Virginia versus Connecticut. So a little bit about what led to that in 2023. Thanks.
Absolutely. So I actually had that at the end, and I felt like we were running out of time, so I cut it off. But so the Connecticut Historical Society had been thinking about changing its name for over 20 years now. And so really the reason behind it is, we have our core supporters, but the general public didn't think that we were a building that you could come in and that a historical society was a place for them. So we were hoping by changing the name to the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, they would see it as something different and a place that would tell their stories and a place where they would find things that are interesting. And the logo, our Connecticut with our notch. Did I answer all parts of your question? Oh, sure. Yeah, okay.
Question. Right. Well, please join me in thanking Andrea and Andrea for that. And please join us next week for our last lecture in the series at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, a lecture by Bill Hosley. There are cookies right over here. Thank you again. Thanks, everyone.